You can use one single museum ticket to get into two of the most fascinating valleys in Cappadocia. In these two valleys, you can explore how these massive fairy chimneys actually formed. Visit a natural tower where a 5th century hermit lived in total isolation, and walk through an entire cave village that was abandoned in the middle of the 20th century. Welcome to our guide to Pasabag Monks Valley and the Zelve Open-Air Museum. Let's first visit the valley with the biggest fairy chimneys of Cappadocia. If you visit, make sure to hold on to your ticket. The sign in Turkish says Pasabagları, but most people call it the Monks Valley. These rock formations here were all formed naturally. Before you visit Cappadocia, you might think the fairy chimneys are man-made, and the caves where people used to live were naturally formed. It's actually the other way around. Natural erosion such as rain and wind shaped these fairy chimneys, and when we say people used to live in the caves, most people think about ancient cavemen or troglodytes. But people, even 100 years ago, used to live in these caves. Pasabag is the perfect spot for us to talk about the rock formations of Cappadocia. The rock here is called Tuff Rock. It's spelled Tuff, and it is a volcanic rock. Millions of years ago, the volcanoes of Cappadocia erupted, and not lava, but ash settled down in the water. The ash calcified into the tuff rock. We call it tuff, but it is soft and porous. If you look around in Cappadocia, you would see rocks of many different colors. So people think there are many different types of rocks, but actually there are two of them. The tuff rock, made of ashes, and the basalt rock. Because of different mineral compositions, the tuff rock can look very different to our eyes because of different colors. For instance, the famous Red Valley of Cappadocia is where iron minerals have oxidized, so the rock looks red and pink. The towering rock formations in the Monks Valley still have basalt rock sitting on the top. Basalt is much more resistant and doesn't erode as easily as the soft tuff rock does. So over thousands of years, the basalt rock acted as an umbrella, protecting the soft layer underneath it from this vertical erosion. Any soft rock with no such protection was washed away. And just as the ground underneath your car after it rains would still be dry, the soft rock underneath the basalt rock was protected. We just need to imagine this happening over and over again for many thousands of years. So eventually, a pillar the exact same size of the basalt rock is formed because everything else around is just washed away. These pillars and their hats, we call them fairy chimneys in Cappadocia. The ground level where you stand used to be as high as the hat of the fairy chimney, and if you ever see the fairy chimneys, you'll soon realize that most of them are missing their hats. What's happened is the fairy chimneys suffered so much erosion that the pillar became thinner, so it could no longer support the heavy basalt rock sitting on top. The basalt hat falls off and leaves a pillar without a hat. These are the older fairy chimneys. Looking at the fairy chimneys of the Monks Valley, which have thick pillars and big hats, we can maybe say these are the youngest fairy chimneys of Cappadocia. In this valley, if you follow the walking path, it will take you to a small courtyard surrounded by fairy chimneys. The monks carved some caves and formed a small community here. They used some vertical shafts to climb into the upper floors where they stored food and wine. If you ever visit this place, it is quite fun climbing into these caves, but I must warn you, there are no safety lines or nets to break your fall, so be extremely careful. In the same valley, but just outside this small community of monks, a hermit used to live in a fairy chimney. Along the same walking path, you'll notice a fairy chimney with 3 hats. That cave on the ground level was a church, and most people just think that's where the hermit used to live. But living inside a cave carved into a fairy chimney was not isolating enough for this hermit. His living quarters were actually above the church. A vertical tunnel to the left is how anyone gained access to the hermit's shelter. This person isolated himself from the rest of the world and dedicated his life to God and biblical studies. With the ticket you have, you can visit the nearby Zelve Open-Air Museum. It's only a 4-minute drive away, and if you don't have a car, you can walk there in about 20 minutes. After visiting a hermit's shelter, looking at the cave houses of Zelve could make you think that this was a whole town of hermits, everyone isolating themselves from the world and getting on with their lives. And that was one of the reasons why people lived in cave houses. It was safety. This was a community of regular people, farmers, sheep herders, winemakers, merchants, millers, just about anyone who would live in a regular town or village, a regular village where people lived in caves. So to understand why they did this, you can just remember that the entire region is covered with the same soft and porous rock formation called tuff. And if you're ever in Cappadocia, you'll see how dry and desert-like this region is. That means almost no trees. So these folks couldn't find sturdy stone or timber to build houses. As they say, necessity is the mother of invention. Not having construction materials made them think and invent alternative ways to create housing. Instead of importing materials, they took advantage of the rock being soft and carved directly into the hillside. A door, maybe a window or two, and a couple of rooms carved into the rock. That's what most of the cave houses look like in Cappadocia. These cave houses are mostly carved in low to medium-sloped hillsides. In modern terms, think of a terracing project, and how retaining walls form an artificial terrace. In Cappadocia, the fronts of the houses are the retaining walls, and the rest of the house is hidden inside the hill. So hopefully my short introduction is helping you understand Cappadocia better. If it's helping you, then consider hitting the like button to return the favor. Zelve Open Air Museum is divided into 3 valleys. The valley on the left is a short one, where you can visit the mill carved into the rock. There are 2 cave churches and some storage areas. Inside the middle valley is another cave church and more abandoned houses. If you follow the path and then the stone stairs on the right-hand side, you can reach the lost valley of Zelve. After taking the stairs down, immediately on the left is a mosque, which is half built and half carved out. Right across from the mosque used to be a monastery. This shows us that a mixed community of Christians and Muslims lived together in the settlement. At the end of the path, if you look up, you can see the decorated pigeon houses. The people would go inside these caves using smartly designed tunnel systems that usually went straight up. They collected pigeon droppings to fertilize their fields. While making their own houses, these people carved only a few rooms. Cave-ins were very frequent, so they had to keep their homes small to reduce the risk. The rooms were living rooms and bedrooms combined into one. A typical household in Cappadocia was a couple, their children, sometimes their sons and daughters-in-law, and even grandchildren. When a branch of the family grew big or successful enough, they would carve their own cave, and so the town would expand. So Zelve was a lively town up until the 50s, that's the 1950s. Landslides, cave-ins, and similar related accidents prompted the government to take action, and many old settlements were abandoned. The people who abandoned their caves had to build new houses on flat areas away from hillsides. They were mostly worried about landslides, so keeping your new home away from any falling rocks was important. The residents of Zelve were unfortunate because this settlement was founded inside the valley, surrounded by steep hills. So they had to evacuate and resettle more than a mile or 2 kilometers away. You can find many towns in Cappadocia that share a similar fate. One great disadvantage of living in a cave house is not having a kitchen in the house. They used a ground oven called a tandoor oven, spelled Tandir. If you're familiar with Indian cuisine, you might have heard of a very similar concept called a tandoor. The rock in Cappadocia is porous and it absorbs smoke, even if you have lots of ventilation. And then, when it gets humid, this rock which absorbed the smoke emits a bad smell, making it difficult to stay inside the cave where you cook. That's why they didn't have a kitchen inside the house. To solve this, they used a different cave where multiple families cooked together using these ground ovens. So the cave houses were private property, but kitchens were communal. It was common to cook meals inside pottery. Most restaurants in Cappadocia still offer the local specialty pottery kebab, which is vegetables and meat cooked in a sealed clay pot. After cooking and cleaning, the pots were hung upside down on trees, which is something you might still find these days, but mostly as a decoration, not a necessity. So far, it might seem like living in a cave brought only troubles, but that was not the case. Carving a cave house was simple and time efficient. It also meant you needed almost no building materials and could get the job done with very simple tools. So one could own a house with little to no investment. The rock also helped with the insulation. Cappadocia's climate is a dry one. It feels like a desert in the summer months between June and August. It's usually around 100 degrees Fahrenheit or about 38 degrees Celsius. Between December and March, it snows and the daytime temperature is usually around 35 to 40 degrees Fahrenheit or 0 to 5 degrees Celsius. And that's during the day. At night, temperatures drop even more. A cave in Cappadocia remains at a steady 60 degrees Fahrenheit or 16 degrees Celsius. So living in a cave house protected the people from these extreme conditions. These two valleys, Monk's Valley and Zelve, are in the center of Cappadocia. They're just a 15-minute drive away from most of the towns where you might stay. To make the most of your time, we suggest taking a tour with a competent guide. If you decide to do so, you can reach us through info@realturkeytours.com. If you have any questions for us, leave a comment or review. Don't forget to subscribe so you never miss a journey. Until next time.